Hey guys, tonight, dim the lights a little. Maybe put the phone face down. Let your shoulders drop. We're going to drift back to a time when America was technically brand new, deeply anxious, and already pretty tired of itself. So just breathe. There's nowhere to be, nothing to do. Just a long, slow story about how the United States almost fell apart, repeatedly, practically as a hobby. Now, when people talk about America almost falling apart, they usually imagine cannons, dramatic speeches, or men with very serious eyebrows yelling about freedom. But the truth is much calmer than that. Much pettier, honestly. A lot of it is paperwork, letters, hurt feelings, and men in powdered wigs absolutely refusing to compromise because, of course they did. Let's start gently, with the ending. The American Revolution wraps up, everyone high-fives, the British leave, and suddenly there's a country, a real one, on paper. And immediately the people running it realize they have no idea how to do that. The first attempt at governing the new United States was something called the Articles of Confederation. And calling it a government is generous. It was more like a group chat where no one could mute anyone else and no one was legally required to listen. Under the Articles, the federal government couldn't tax, it couldn't enforce laws, it couldn't really do much besides politely suggest things and hope the states felt like cooperating, which they did not. Because why would they? Each state thought of itself as basically a tiny country. Virginia was doing its own thing, Massachusetts was stressed, New York was suspicious of everyone, and they all agreed on one thing. A strong central government sounded an awful lot like the British, and they had just finished breaking up with that. So from the very beginning, America existed in this strange, fragile state, technically united, emotionally distant, and one bad argument away from storming off. George Washington, meanwhile, was exhausted. Truly. This man wanted nothing more than to go home, farm quietly, and never hear the word Congress again. But everyone kept looking at him like, please fix this. And eventually, against his better judgment, he agreed. That brings us to the Constitutional Convention, a room full of elites, locked indoors during a hot Philadelphia summer, arguing about human nature, power, and whether small states should matter as much as big ones. Spoiler, they did not agree on most of this. What they did agree on was that the current system was a mess, so they scrapped it and started over. Which sounds bold and visionary, but also kind of unhinged when you think about it. This isn't working, let's rewrite everything. The Constitution that came out of that room was clever, complicated, and absolutely full of compromises that everyone knew would cause problems later. But later was future America's problem. Present America was just trying to survive the week. Even after the Constitution was written, ratifying it nearly tore the country apart. Some states were very into it, others were deeply suspicious. The debates were intense, accusations flew, pamphlets were written, so many pamphlets. Everyone had thoughts and they were all extremely confident. Eventually it passed, barely, and the United States officially had a stronger central government, which solved some problems and created several brand new ones. Almost immediately, political factions formed. Not parties officially, oh no. Everyone insisted they hated parties, but they absolutely had parties. On one side, you had the Federalists. They liked a strong central government, a national bank, and wearing the metaphorical pants in the relationship. Alexander Hamilton was their star. Brilliant, ambitious, and deeply irritating to half the country. On the other side, you had the Democratic Republicans. They liked states' rights, smaller government, and the idea that Hamilton should maybe talk less. Thomas Jefferson led this group, despite the fact that he hated confrontation and preferred writing long letters instead of saying things to people's faces. These two camps did not get along, at all. They assumed the worst about each other. Federalists thought Jefferson's followers wanted chaos.
Jefferson thought the Federalists wanted a monarchy with better branding. And George Washington stuck in the middle, again, trying to keep everyone calm, again, writing farewell speeches begging the nation not to split into factions, which, of course, they immediately ignored. By the time Washington stepped down, the country was already wobbling. The next president, John Adams, inherited a political landscape full of resentment, paranoia, and unresolved beef. And Adams, bless him, was not exactly a calming presence. John Adams was smart, patriotic, and extremely sensitive. He took criticism personally, very personally. And when tensions with France escalated into what's known as the Quasi-War, an undeclared naval conflict that sounds fake but was very real, things got worse. Fear of foreign influence spread, fear of dissent spread, and in a moment of peak insecurity, the government passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws made it easier to deport immigrants and illegal to criticize the government. Yes, really. Jefferson and his allies were furious. States began openly resisting federal laws. They wrote resolutions suggesting that states could simply ignore laws they didn't like, which is not a great precedent for a country trying to stay together. At this point, America was still young, still unsure, and already flirting with the idea that unity was optional. The election of 1800 didn't help. It was bitter, ugly, and full of insults that make modern politics look restrained. Adams lost, Jefferson won, and for the first time, power transferred peacefully between rival factions. This was good, objectively, but emotionally, the losing side was convinced the country was doomed. And then something quietly enormous happened. Jefferson, now president, made the Louisiana Purchase. He bought an absurd amount of land from France, doubling the size of the country overnight. It was an incredible deal, also possibly unconstitutional. Jefferson knew this. He did it anyway. Because that's a theme here. America survives by bending its own rules just enough not to snap them entirely. As the country expanded westward, new problems followed. Every new state raised the same question: free or slave? And every time the answer felt temporary, delicate, like stacking plates too high and pretending gravity doesn't exist. The Missouri Compromise was one of those plates. It balanced free and slave states just enough to keep things from collapsing. Everyone knew it wasn't permanent, but everyone agreed not to talk about that part. Meanwhile, the economy shifted. Regions developed different interests. The North industrialized. The South leaned harder into agriculture and slavery. They needed each other and resented each other, a perfect recipe for long-term tension. Presidents came and went. Some were competent, some were not. As for Andrew Jackson, he was a walking conflict generator, charismatic, aggressive, and absolutely convinced he was right about everything. During his presidency, South Carolina decided it could nullify federal tariffs it disliked. Jackson's response was essentially, "Try me." He threatened military force against a state, against his own country. This was the nullification crisis. And for a moment, it really looked like the United States might fracture over taxes of all things, not ideology, not morality, tariffs. A compromise was reached, crisis averted. For now. But the pattern was clear. Every decade, the country reached a point where it almost snapped, and every time it stepped back, barely. By the 1840s and 1850s, the tension around slavery became impossible to ignore. New territories meant new debates, new compromises, new arguments that felt louder and more desperate than the last. People stopped pretending this was temporary. Violence broke out in places like Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers literally fought over the future. Senators brawled in Congress. One was beaten with a cane on the Senate floor. Democracy, but make it unhinged. The Supreme Court made things worse with the Dred Scott decision, declaring that Black Americans could not be citizens and that Congress couldn't ban slavery in territories. This satisfied almost no one and enraged almost everyone. Trust between regions evaporated. And then Abraham Lincoln was elected. Lincoln didn't even win a majority of the popular vote. He didn't appear on the ballot in many southern states. To them, his election felt illegitimate, like the system itself had turned against them. So they left. Just like that, one by one. States seceded. They formed their own government, their own constitution, and insisted this was all very legal and very reasonable. From their perspective, the Union had already failed. From the Union's perspective, the country was coming apart at the seams. And here's the quiet, unsettling truth. At that moment, it really could have ended. The United States was not guaranteed to survive. It wasn't inevitable. It was fragile, exhausted, and deeply divided. As Lincoln took office,
no sudden movements, no dramatic music. Just slide back into the soft hum of history, doing that thing where it slowly inches toward disaster while insisting everything is under control. When we left off, Abraham Lincoln had just taken office, and several states had already walked out the door, slammed it politely, and declared themselves a brand new country, which is bold, especially when the old country still owns most of the furniture. Now, Lincoln, contrary to popular imagination, did not stride into Washington ready to unleash war. Quite the opposite. He was cautious, almost painfully so. He understood something very important. If he moved too fast, the remaining slave states might leave too, and then there really would be no United States left to save. So his early presidency was defined by restraint, endless restraint. Letters, speeches, carefully worded statements that tried very hard not to sound like threats or promises or anything at all, really. Meanwhile, the Confederacy was organizing itself, writing a constitution that looked suspiciously like the U.S. Constitution but with clearer protections for slavery, electing Jefferson Davis as president, a man who had the energy of someone constantly annoyed that history had given him homework. Both sides told themselves this would be quick, clean, minimal. Everyone loves to believe that at the beginning of a disaster. It's comforting. Incorrect, but comforting. The real problem was Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a federal military fort sitting in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, which, inconveniently, was now Confederate territory, according to the Confederacy, and according to the Union, absolutely not. Lincoln knew that abandoning the fort would look weak, but reinforcing it would look like aggression. So he did the most Lincoln thing possible. He delayed. He sent supplies, not soldiers, food, not weapons, a polite gesture that said, "We're still here," without technically saying, "We're here to fight." The Confederacy did not appreciate this nuance. They opened fire. And just like that, the thing everyone had been tiptoeing around became unavoidable. War began not with a grand ideological speech, but with a misunderstanding about supplies and sovereignty. Once the first shots were fired, everything sped up. States chose sides. Brothers found themselves on opposite teams. Washington, D.C. felt suddenly very exposed, sitting awkwardly between slave states that hadn't yet decided what they were doing. The Union Army, it turned out, was not ready. The Confederacy wasn't either, but confidence can carry you a long way early on. The first major battle, Bull Run, ended with Union forces retreating in chaos, civilians who had come to watch the battle like a picnic scattered in panic. This was not going to be short. At home, things were tense. Newspapers screamed, politicians argued, ordinary people worried about sons and husbands who had gone off wearing uniforms that still smelled new. And Lincoln? Lincoln aged, visibly. The weight of the war showed in his face, in his posture, in the way his humor grew darker and drier. He was a man constantly absorbing grief, criticism, and impossible decisions, and somehow continuing anyway. As the war dragged on, the question of slavery loomed larger and larger. At first, the Union insisted the war was about preserving the nation, not ending slavery. This was strategic, necessary, and deeply unsatisfying to abolitionists. But over time, it became impossible to separate the two. Enslaved people fled plantations to Union lines. They forced the issue simply by existing in the middle of it. The war began to change shape.
The Emancipation Proclamation was both monumental and limited. It declared freedom for enslaved people in rebelling states, not border states, not areas already under Union control, which sounds confusing because it was. But symbolically, it transformed the war. It reframed the Union's purpose, and it made compromise with the Confederacy much harder. You can't easily negotiate your way back into a system you've publicly condemned. The cost was staggering. Battles piled up, casualties mounted, towns were destroyed. The optimism of 1861 was long gone, replaced by exhaustion and mourning. And yet, even at the height of the Civil War, there were moments when peace felt possible. Talks were suggested, back-channel communications floated around, the idea that maybe, just maybe, this could end without total collapse. But every path forward demanded something someone else refused to give. By 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Resources were gone, morale was shattered, cities fell one by one. And when Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, it felt briefly like the nightmare was over. The Union had survived. But surviving isn't the same as healing. Lincoln knew this. He spoke about reconciliation, about rebuilding, about binding up wounds rather than tearing them open again. His second inaugural address was quiet, reflective, almost mournful, not a victory speech, a warning. And then he was assassinated, just days after the war ended. It's hard to overstate how destabilizing that was. The one man capable of guiding the country through peace was gone, replaced by Andrew Johnson, a man with strong opinions, limited patience, and very little interest in compromise. Reconstruction began badly, quickly. Southern states resisted change. Black Americans faced violence, intimidation, and broken promises. Northern support waned. The political will to enforce equality eroded. Once again, the country hovered near fracture, not through secession this time, but through neglect, through exhaustion, through the quiet decision to move on without fixing what had been broken. Federal troops eventually withdrew from the South. Jimmy Crow laws rose. The Union remained intact on maps, but deeply divided in reality. And that's the thing about almost falling apart. It doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like compromise fatigue, like choosing stability over justice, like deciding not to pull too hard on a thread because you're afraid of what might unravel. As the decades passed, America industrialized, grew richer, louder, more powerful. But those old fractures never fully disappeared. They settled into the foundation, out of sight, still there. The late 19th century brought labor unrest, massive inequality, strikes that turned violent, federal troops sent against workers, the government once again facing the question of whose side it was really on. Populist movements surged, farmers struggled, cities expanded, immigrants arrived in waves bringing hope and fear in equal measure. Every era found new ways to test the Union's resilience, and every time the country bent. Sometimes gracefully, sometimes barely. By the time the 20th century arrived, America had survived its bloodiest internal conflict, but it had learned a dangerous lesson, that it could endure incredible strain without truly resolving its deepest issues, which meant those issues would come back, later, in different forms. So let's drift forward, past the smoke of the Civil War, past the uneasy quiet of Reconstruction, toward a new century, a louder one, faster, more confident.
The Civil War is technically over. The maps are stable again. The flags are where they're supposed to be. And America, ever optimistic, tells itself that the worst is behind it, that the hard part is done, that history has peaked in its ability to cause stress, which, of course, is adorable. As the 20th century creeps in, the United States begins to move faster. Factories hum, cities swell, railroads stitch the continent together like uneven seams. Money flows upward, work flows downward, and somewhere in the middle, a lot of people start feeling like the system might not be working quite the way it was advertised. This era is often called the Gilded Age, which is a polite way of saying shiny on the outside, deeply questionable underneath. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few men with last names that sounded increasingly permanent. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan. These men were hailed as captains of industry, which sounds nautical and heroic, even when they were quietly crushing competition and labor unions at the same time. Workers, meanwhile, were having a different experience. Long hours, low pay, dangerous conditions, children working jobs no adult should have, accidents treated as personal failures. If you died, that was unfortunate. Someone else would take your place. Strikes broke out. Big ones, loud ones, the kind that made the government nervous. And here's where the pattern returns. The federal government once again found itself choosing between order and fairness, and once again, it chose order. Troops were sent in, strikes were broken, workers were reminded, sometimes violently, where power lived. This wasn't a civil war, technically, but it was a kind of internal conflict, a quiet one, where trust eroded slowly, not with cannon fire, but with batons and court orders. At the same time, America was flexing outward. The Spanish-American War was short, decisive, and extremely good for national confidence. The United States suddenly had overseas territories, a navy, an opinion about global affairs. For the first time, the country began to see itself not just as a fragile republic, but as a power. And that confidence masked a lot of anxiety, because inside the country, change was relentless. Immigrants arrived in massive numbers, cities became crowded, cultures mixed, languages overlapped, and not everyone was thrilled about it. Nativism surged, fear of the other became a political tool. Laws were passed to restrict immigration. Certain groups were blamed for crime, poverty, or simply existing too visibly. Progressivism emerged as a response. Reformers pushed for regulation, labor protections, women's suffrage, and cleaner governance. The idea that the system could be fixed from within still felt plausible. And for a while, it worked. Somewhat. Then came World War I. America entered late, loudly, and with a sense of moral purpose. But the war didn't just change Europe, it changed the United States. Fear became policy. The Espionage Act and Sedition Act made it dangerous to criticize the government or the war effort. People were arrested for speeches, for pamphlets, for thoughts that leaned the wrong way. German Americans were targeted, socialists were surveilled, loyalty was demanded loudly and constantly. Once again, the nation flirted with the idea that unity required silence. After the war, the pressure didn't release, it intensified. The Red Scare swept through the country. Fear of communism became a kind of national obsession. Raids were conducted, suspects arrested without due process. The idea that America could be undermined from within took hold. It wasn't entirely new, but it was louder now, more organized, more paranoid. At the same time, the economy boomed. The 1920s sparkled, jazz played, money flowed, stocks climbed, and the country leaned into the idea that prosperity was permanent. It was not. The stock market crashed in 1929, and with it the illusion that the system was stable. Banks failed, savings vanished, jobs disappeared, lines formed, hunger spread. The Great Depression didn't just break the economy, it broke faith. Faith in markets, faith in leadership, faith that hard work guaranteed safety. People turned to extremes. Some flirted with socialism, others with authoritarianism. Demagogues drew crowds. Ideas that once seemed unthinkable felt suddenly reasonable. This was another moment, one of those quiet crossroads, where the country could have tipped, where desperation made radical solutions attractive. Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped into this chaos with confidence and charm. Fireside chats, big promises, massive government programs. The New Deal expanded federal power in ways that would have terrified earlier generations. And yet, people accepted it, because the alternative felt worse. Roosevelt wasn't universally loved. Critics accused him of overreach, of flirting with tyranny, of fundamentally altering the American system. The Supreme Court pushed back, Congress hesitated,
Tensions simmered, but the system held. Again. World War II followed. Another unifying force, another external threat that temporarily smoothed internal divisions. The country mobilized, industry roared back to life, purpose returned. But unity came at a cost. Japanese Americans were interned, civil liberties were suspended, fear once again justified injustice. After the war, America emerged powerful, confident, rich, and deeply anxious. The Cold War settled in like a low-grade fever. Nuclear weapons, proxy wars, constant suspicion. The idea that the world could end at any moment became background noise. At home, this fear manifested as McCarthyism, accusations, blacklists, careers destroyed on suspicion alone. The government once again turned inward, hunting for enemies among its own people. And once again, the country bent without breaking. Institutions strained, trust eroded, but collapse did not come. The 1950s looked calm on the surface. Suburbs, television, smiles. But beneath that calm was pressure, especially for those excluded from the American dream. The civil rights movement forced the nation to confront its contradictions. Peaceful protests were met with violence. Children faced police dogs. Images shocked the world. The federal government intervened, slowly, reluctantly, but decisively enough to matter. This, too, could have torn the country apart, and in some ways it nearly did. Riots erupted, assassinations followed, leaders were lost. The 1960s were loud, chaotic, angry. Vietnam deepened divisions, trust in government collapsed, protests filled streets, campuses burned with tension. For a moment, it felt like everything was unraveling at once. Authority questioned, systems doubted, the idea of a shared national narrative frayed. And then, gradually, the noise faded. Not because everything was resolved, but because people were tired. Which, if we're being honest, is how America survives a lot of things. By the 1970s, the country was bruised, but intact. Watergate revealed corruption at the highest level. A president resigned. The system absorbed the shock. And once again, the republic continued. No dramatic ending, no collapse, just another close call quietly added to the pile. We'll drift further soon, towards the late 19th century, towards a different kind of fracture, one less visible, more psychological. Because the day America almost fell apart isn't one day, it's a pattern, and it keeps repeating.
By the late 1970s and early 1980s, America had reached an interesting emotional state. Not panicked, not unified, just tired, a little cynical, a little unsure what it believed anymore. Vietnam had ended badly. Trust in government was bruised. Watergate had confirmed everyone's worst suspicions, which is never comforting. The economy stumbled. Inflation rose, gas lines formed, confidence dipped, and into this moment stepped Ronald Reagan, smiling like everything was going to be okay, which psychologically mattered more than policy for a while. Reagan spoke in simple terms, optimistic ones. He framed America as strong again, proud again, less self-critical, more certain. And a lot of people wanted that feeling very badly. The Cold War, meanwhile, was still humming in the background. Nuclear missiles pointed at invisible targets, air raid drills remembered vaguely, the possibility of annihilation treated as a fact of life rather than an emergency. It's strange what humans can normalize. The 1980s brought wealth back for some. Inequality widened quietly. Corporate power grew. Unions weakened, but the mood music stayed upbeat. As long as the stock market was smiling, most people tried not to look too closely at the foundation. Then the Cold War ended. And this is important because for nearly half a century, the United States had defined itself against an external enemy, communism, the Soviet Union, the idea that we were not them. And suddenly, that was gone. The Soviet Union collapsed, not with a bang, but with paperwork and confusion. One day, America woke up and realized it had won, and it didn't quite know what to do with that. The 1990s felt oddly calm, economically strong, politically centrist. History, some claimed, was over. Liberal democracy had triumphed. The future would be boring and prosperous, which, again, adorable. Because under that calm surface, new tensions were forming, cultural ones, economic ones, technological ones. The internet arrived, slowly at first, then all at once. Information became abundant. Authority became optional. Everyone suddenly had a platform, and not everyone used it gently. Cable news expanded. Opinion replaced reporting. Outrage became a business model. Politics turned into a kind of entertainment. Lines hardened. At the same time, globalization accelerated. Jobs moved overseas. Communities hollowed out. The benefits were real but uneven, and uneven benefits tend to breed resentment. Then came September 11th, 2001. For a brief moment, America snapped back into unity. Flags appeared everywhere. Fear was shared. Grief was collective. The country felt wounded, but together. That unity didn't last. The war on terror stretched on. Iraq divided opinion. Trust in intelligence collapsed again. Civil liberties were curtailed in the name of security. Surveillance expanded quietly. Fear became institutionalized. Once more, America told itself this was temporary, necessary, controlled. The 2008 financial crisis shattered that illusion. Banks failed. Markets crashed. Homes were lost. Retirement vanished. And the response, bailing out institutions while individuals struggled, left a deep scar. People felt betrayed, not just economically, but morally. The system had failed, and the people responsible seemed largely untouched. Anger simmered. Movements rose. Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party rallies, very different ideologies but rooted in the same feeling that the country was no longer working for everyone. Social media poured fuel on everything. Algorithms rewarded outrage. Nuance disappeared. Conversations became performances. Identity hardened. By the 2010s, the United States was no longer just divided by policy. It was divided by reality itself. People consumed different information, trusted different sources, lived in different mental worlds. And this is where the danger deepened. Because a nation can survive disagreement, it struggles to survive when it can't agree on basic facts. Elections became flashpoints. Every loss felt illegitimate. Every win felt temporary. Institutions were questioned constantly, sometimes fairly, sometimes recklessly. Trust eroded, slowly, persistently. And then came 2020, a pandemic, economic shutdowns, isolation, fear, death counts scrolling endlessly across screens. Normal life paused, anxiety spiked. At the same time, political tension exploded. Protests filled streets, some peaceful, some not. The country argued about masks, about science, about freedom, about reality. An election followed, contentious, emotional, disputed. And when it ended, a portion of the population refused to accept the result. On January 6, 2021, the unthinkable happened. A mob stormed the U.S. Capitol, the symbol of democratic governance breached by citizens convinced the system had failed them. It wasn't a coup in the traditional sense. It was messy, chaotic, disorganized. But symbolically, it mattered, because it showed how fragile things had become. For a moment, the world watched and wondered, is this it? Is this the breaking point? And once again, the system held, barely. Certifications completed, transitions occurred, the republic continued. But something had shifted. The idea that America was immune to collapse no longer felt convincing. The cracks were visible now, not theoretical, not historical, present. And here's the sleepy, uncomfortable truth. The United States didn't almost fall apart on one single day. It keeps almost falling apart, over and over, in slow motion. It survives through institutions, through inertia, through the simple fact that most people wake up, go to work, and want things to be okay. That's not heroic, that's human. As we drift toward the present, the question isn't whether America will face another moment like this, it's how it will respond when it does. With fear or patience, with curiosity or certainty. History doesn't end. It hums, it loops, it waits, and America, like it always has, lives somewhere between confidence and collapse, between idealism and exhaustion. Still here, still arguing, still standing.
Because if you're waiting for a single moment when America clearly, definitively almost fell apart, you're going to be waiting forever. That moment doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with fatigue, with eye rolls, with people quietly deciding they're done arguing for the night. And that's kind of the point. If you step back far enough, the United States doesn't behave like a heroic story. It behaves like a stressed-out household that keeps paying the mortgage out of spite. No one fully agrees. Everyone thinks the others are wrong, but leaving would be worse, so they stay. Barely. What keeps America from collapsing isn't constant unity. It's routine, bureaucracy, inertia, the boring mechanics of daily life continuing even when trust is low. Elections still happen, courts still issue rulings, trucks still deliver groceries, teachers still show up. People still complain about traffic and weather and gas prices. The mundane keeps winning. This has always been true. During the Civil War, farmers still planted crops. During the Great Depression, people still married, laughed, and went to baseball games when they could. During the Cold War, families still watched sitcoms while quietly wondering if tomorrow would exist. Normal life is stubborn like that. In the present moment, America feels fragile because awareness is high. Every argument is visible, every conflict amplified, every crack zoomed in on and replayed endlessly. But fragility doesn't automatically mean collapse. Historically, the country has lived in a constant state of almost. Almost broke apart over federal power, almost fractured over slavery, almost tipped into authoritarianism during fear-driven eras, almost tore itself apart over ideology, war, race, class, economics, and identity. And each time, it didn't resolve everything. It deferred, adjusted, papered over problems, and moved forward anyway. That's not noble, it's just survival. One of the least romantic truths of history is that nations rarely collapse because everyone suddenly agrees it's time. They collapse when enough people stop showing up, when systems lose legitimacy so completely that no one bothers to maintain them. America, for all its tension, hasn't reached that point. People still care too much. They argue because they believe something is worth arguing over. Apathy, not anger, is usually the real warning sign. That doesn't mean things are fine, far from it. Inequality remains sharp, trust remains thin, political identity has hardened into something personal and defensive. Compromise feels like surrender, certainty feels safer than curiosity. Those are dangerous conditions, but they're not new. They echo earlier eras, the 1850s, the 1930s, the late 1960s, times when the country felt unrecognizable to itself, when headlines screamed and institutions shook and people whispered, "This can't go on like this." And yet, it did. Differently, imperfectly, sometimes unfairly, but continuously. America's real talent isn't moral clarity, it's adaptability, messy, reluctant adaptability, the kind that happens after things get uncomfortable enough that standing still feels worse than changing. That's how amendments pass, how norms shift, how power slowly redistributes, not because everyone agrees, but because enough people decide the old way is exhausting. The day America almost fell apart is not behind us. It's not ahead of us. It's woven through the whole story. It's in the pauses between elections, in the court decisions that disappoint half the country, in the protests that make the other half uncomfortable.
in the quiet moments when people realize the system didn't collapse today either. History doesn't offer guarantees, it offers patterns. And the pattern here is simple. America approaches the edge, leans over, looks down, argues about whether the edge is even real, and then steps back just enough to keep going. Not healed, not resolved, just still here. So if tonight's story leaves you feeling unsettled, that's normal. That's kind of the authentic American experience, living inside a long, unfinished argument and hoping it doesn't turn violent again. Dim the lights a little more. Let the noise fade. The country will still be complicated in the morning. History will still be unresolved. And somehow, against its own expectations, the United States will probably still be there.
At this point in the story, a lot of people like to ask a very specific question. Is this the worst it's ever been? And the answer, gently, sleepily, is probably not. But it always feels like it is when you're inside it. That's another pattern. Every generation believes the ground beneath them is softer than it used to be, that the rules are thinner, that the systems are shakier. And in a way, they're not wrong. Systems don't reset to factory settings. They accumulate stress. They carry old compromises like quiet injuries. America is no exception. After moments of near collapse, what usually follows isn't clarity. It's a kind of emotional hangover. People want stability, predictability, something boring enough to trust. You can see this after the Civil War, after the Great Depression, after Vietnam, after Watergate, after the Cold War, after 9/11, after 2008, after 2020. The country doesn't leap forward. It slows down. It recalibrates. It argues less loudly for a while, not because it agrees, but because it's tired of shouting. That's where America often lives, in the aftershock. The danger in these periods isn't immediate collapse, it's complacency. The belief that because the system survived last time, it will automatically survive next time without maintenance. History is very clear about this part. Survival is not passive. It requires attention, boring attention, procedural attention, the kind that doesn't trend. Courts matter, local elections matter, civic norms matter. Trust matters even when it's inconvenient, especially then. When those things erode slowly, people don't panic. They adapt. They stop expecting fairness. They lower standards. They disengage just enough to get by. That's when nations get hollow. America hasn't fully hollowed out, but it has thinned in places. Confidence in institutions is lower than it once was. Media trust is fragmented. Shared narratives are rare. Instead of one national story, there are many overlapping ones, each convinced the others are dangerous or delusional. This isn't new either. It just moves faster now. Technology compresses time. Outrage cycles shrink. Memory shortens. Everything feels urgent and disposable at the same time. Historically, this kind of environment is unstable, not explosively so, more like erosion, the slow wearing down of patience. But erosion can be countered, not with grand gestures, with maintenance. America's near-collapse moments have always been followed by periods of institutional reinforcement, amendments, reforms, expansions of rights, adjustments to power. They don't arrive all at once, and they don't satisfy everyone, but they arrive because the alternative becomes unbearable. That's the quiet engine of change. It's tempting to imagine collapse as dramatic, flags falling, governments dissolving, history books ending chapters with a thud. But most collapses look dull from the inside. Missed elections, ignored rulings, shrugged shoulders, a slow withdrawal of belief. America has flirted with that outcome before. It stepped back not because it was noble, but because enough people still cared. Care is the fragile thing. Anger often masquerades as care, so does fear.
Even cynicism is sometimes just disappointment wearing armor. The opposite of care isn't disagreement, it's indifference. And despite everything, the noise, the tension, the exhaustion, America is not indifferent yet. People still vote, protest, sue, argue, write, complain, demand better, demand worse, demand something. That noise is uncomfortable, but silence would be worse. So when we talk about the day America almost fell apart, what we're really talking about is a recurring state of tension, a standing invitation to fail, one the country keeps declining at the last minute. Not because it's destined to survive, but because so far enough people have decided they're not done with it. That decision is renewed quietly, daily, by showing up, by arguing within the system instead of abandoning it, by choosing frustration over apathy. That's not poetic, it's practical, and it's fragile. Which brings us back to tonight, to this moment, to you listening, to the soft hum of a nation that has never been finished and probably never will be. America exists in the long night after the almost, always has, always will. So if you're feeling uneasy about the future, that feeling has a long lineage. You're sharing it with farmers in 1790, factory workers in 1890, soldiers in 1945, students in 1968, office workers in 2008. They all thought they were standing at the edge. Some were closer than others. And yet, morning came. Dim the lights a little more. Let history keep humming in the background. It doesn't need your vigilance right now, just your awareness.
Just a little further. Not toward an ending, just toward quiet. By now, you might notice something slightly unsettling about this whole story. There is no final collapse. No triumphant stabilization either. Just a country that seems permanently parked near the edge, unpacked, making itself at home where most nations would rather not linger. And that's unusual. Most countries either fracture dramatically or harden into something rigid. America does neither particularly well. It stretches, it absorbs, it complains loudly while continuing to function in ways that feel almost accidental. This creates a strange emotional environment, one where people are constantly warned that everything is falling apart, while simultaneously being expected to go to work on Monday. That contradiction is exhausting. Historically, Americans have lived under a steady background anxiety that something essential might be slipping. Liberty, prosperity, identity, truth. The definition changes, but the feeling stays remarkably consistent. In the 1790s, it was fear of monarchy returning. In the 1860s, fear of disunion. In the 1930s, fear of economic collapse. In the 1950s, fear of ideological infection. In the 1970s, fear of institutional corruption. In the 2000s, fear of terrorism. In the 2020s, fear of each other. Same unease, new costume. What makes America durable isn't that it resolves these fears. It doesn't. It compartmentalizes them. It argues about them in courts, legislatures, media, and living rooms, rather than settling them all at once in the streets. Sometimes it fails at even that, briefly, painfully, but not long enough to end itself. That's not destiny, it's habit. A habit formed early when the country learned that breaking apart was easy, but putting things back together was harder, and occasionally worth attempting. Even during its worst moments, America rarely agrees on what falling apart would actually look like. One group's collapse is another group's correction. One person's crisis is another person's overdue reckoning. This lack of consensus is frustrating, but it also prevents clean breaks. No single faction ever fully owns the narrative. Power remains contested. Authority remains conditional.
And legitimacy, while bruised, is never entirely abandoned. That's the soft barrier against collapse. The danger, of course, is that living forever on the edge normalizes the edge. People stop treating instability as a warning and start treating it as scenery. When everything feels fragile, nothing feels urgent. History suggests this is where the real risk lives, not in moments of loud conflict, but in long stretches of low trust, where people expect less, demand less, and settle into quiet disengagement. America isn't fully there, but it's brushed close enough to recognize the shape. Still, there's something oddly grounding in knowing this pattern isn't new. That fear about the country's survival has always existed alongside the country itself. The Republic was born anxious. It grew up anxious. It matured into a superpower still quietly anxious about whether it deserved to exist at all. That self-doubt is uncomfortable, but it has also acted as a brake, a hesitation before irreversible decisions, a second thought, sometimes even a third. Other nations have charged forward with certainty. America has shuffled forward with questions. Messy, inefficient, occasionally infuriating, but strangely resilient. So when people say, "This feels like the moment it all falls apart," history gently shrugs and says, "Yes, it often does." And then it adds, "And usually it doesn't." Not because everything turns out fine, but because collapse requires agreement, and America famously struggles to agree on anything. That might be its greatest flaw. It might also be its quiet strength. As we slow things down now, let that sit without judgment. No optimism, no despair, just observation. The United States remains what it has always been, an argument that never adjourns, a system under constant review, a place where the edge isn't a destination, but a recurring stop. And somehow, improbably, people keep getting off there, looking around, and deciding to stay a little longer. So tonight, there's nothing to resolve, no lesson to underline, no conclusion to announce, just the soft understanding that almost falling apart isn't an exception in American history. It's the rhythm. Let the rhythm fade into the background now. History doesn't need to be watched every second. It's been doing this a long time.
At this point in the story, something subtle happens. Not in history itself, but in how people feel about it. After enough near misses, enough warnings, enough "this could be the end" moments that aren't,
A strange familiarity sets in. The noise stops sounding like an alarm. It starts sounding like background static. America has been living with that static for a very long time. You can hear it in how people talk about politics now. Less shock, more fatigue. Less disbelief, more resignation. Phrases like "of course" and "here we go again" replace outrage.
expectations lower, not because people don't care, but because caring constantly is exhausting. Historically, this is a dangerous lull, not because collapse is imminent, but because vigilance turns into routine.
When instability becomes familiar, people stop responding to it with urgency and start managing it emotionally instead. They joke about it, meme it, roll their eyes, keep scrolling. And yet, life continues. Children still grow up assuming the country will exist when they're older. Businesses still plan 5, 10, 20 years ahead. Governments still issue bonds assuming someone will be around to pay them back. These are quiet acts of faith, not loud patriotism, just assumption. The belief that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to be navigable. That assumption has carried America through every previous near collapse. But it has always depended on one thing, that when pushed far enough, people re-engage. History shows this again and again. A period of drift, then pressure, then a moment where enough people decide the system needs attention. Not reinvention, maintenance. Maintenance is deeply unglamorous. It doesn't come with speeches that echo through time. It comes with budgets, court cases, zoning laws, boring reforms, and arguments that never trend. But it's what keeps the structure upright. When America almost fell apart during the Great Depression, it wasn't saved by inspiration alone. It was saved by policy, by expanding what government was allowed to do, by adjusting assumptions about markets and responsibility. When it nearly fractured during the Civil Rights era, it wasn't rescued by a single march or speech. It was sustained by legislation, enforcement, and decades of uncomfortable follow-through. Near-collapse moments don't resolve themselves emotionally. They resolve administratively. That's a hard truth to sit with, especially in an age that prefers symbols to systems. The modern American tension, the one people feel in their chests, comes from sensing that systems are strained while symbols are louder than ever. Flags, slogans, personalities, identities, all very visible, all very emotional. Meanwhile, the quieter machinery underneath struggles for attention. History suggests that if the machinery is ignored long enough, symbols eventually lose their power too. Not explosively, they just stop meaning what they used to. America hasn't reached that stage, but it has brushed close enough to notice the silence growing in certain places. Town halls half empty, local races uncontested, civic participation uneven. Those aren't headlines, but they're signals. Still, there's another side to this story, one that's easy to miss if you focus only on national tension. Local America, messy, inconsistent, human, continues to solve problems in small, unremarkable ways. Neighbors organize, courts rule, schools adopt, communities argue and adjust. This decentralization has always been part of America's resilience. Power is spread out, sometimes inefficiently, sometimes frustratingly, but rarely all in one place. That means collapse, if it ever comes, would be uneven, slow, confusing, less like a fall and more like a gradual forgetting of how things used to work. Which brings us back to the title of tonight's story, The Day America Almost Fell Apart. It sounds dramatic, singular, cinematic, but history doesn't work that way here. America almost falls apart in increments, in court decisions that erode trust, in elections that half the country doubts, in moments when people ask not, what should we do, but is it even worth trying? And then, just as often, someone tries anyway. That trying is rarely celebrated. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels like obligation or stubbornness or habit, but it adds up. So as we drift further into this quiet stretch of reflection, it's worth noticing what hasn't happened. The Constitution hasn't been abandoned. Elections haven't stopped. Power still changes hands, even when contested. Courts still issue rulings that matter. States still push against federal authority, and vice versa. The argument continues, which means the relationship continues. That doesn't guarantee the future. Nothing does. But history suggests that as long as the argument remains procedural, channeled through systems rather than settled by force, America stays in the realm of almost. And almost, strangely enough, has been enough. Let the static fade a bit now. No need to monitor every crack tonight. The structure is still standing, not because it's perfect, but because it's being held up imperfectly by millions of small, boring decisions.
Still drifting, still unhurried, still sitting with a country that has never fully decided what it wants to be, only what it doesn't want to become. By now, something else starts to feel familiar. Not just the noise, not just the tension, but the attitude toward it. A kind of collective shrug. Not apathy exactly, more like acceptance. The sense that things are functional enough. Flawed, yes. Frustrating, absolutely. But not broken enough to demand immediate overhaul. Good enough is a powerful force in history.
It's what keeps systems running long after their original logic has faded. It's what allows institutions to limp forward without collapsing or reforming. It's comfortable, it's stable, and it's quietly risky. America has lived in good enough mode many times before. After Reconstruction failed, the country moved on, not because justice had been achieved, but because reopening the issue felt exhausting. The system worked well enough for those in power. That was sufficient. After the labor battles of the early 20th century, reforms were introduced. Some protections, some regulations, not a full reimagining of economic fairness, just enough to quiet unrest. After Watergate, trust in government never fully recovered, but it didn't have to. The system corrected the most visible abuse, then carried on with slightly lower expectations. Each time, good enough prevented collapse. Each time, it also preserved unresolved problems. This is the trade-off America keeps making. Stability now, complexity later. The danger of living permanently in that space is subtle. People stop imagining better outcomes. Not worse ones, those are easy, but better ones, structural ones, long-term ones. When expectations shrink, systems don't fail loudly. They thin out. They lose capacity. They become brittle. History shows that collapse rarely arrives when things are at their worst. It arrives when people no longer believe improvement is possible. That belief hasn't vanished in America, but it has become uneven, concentrated, conditional. Some communities feel deeply invested in the future. Others feel written off. Some trust institutions. Others treat them as obstacles. These differences don't automatically tear a country apart, but they do create friction that never fully cools. That friction is where near collapse lives. And yet, the other side of good enough is resilience, the ability to tolerate imperfection without demanding purity, the willingness to operate in gray areas, to accept half measures while pushing slowly for more. America has always been a half-measure country, a nation of compromises that satisfy no one completely but offend no one enough to walk away en masse. That's frustrating, but it's also why the structure keeps standing. When you look at countries that did collapse, the pattern is different. They pursued certainty, total solutions, final answers. They demanded alignment or exclusion. America rarely aligns fully. It clusters, it argues, it negotiates, it postpones. Postponement doesn't sound heroic, but it has bought time, again and again. The modern era feels precarious because the pace is faster. Social change accelerates. Economic shocks ripple globally. Information overwhelms. The margin for error feels thinner. But structurally, the country is still doing what it has always done, absorbing pressure, distributing conflict, letting things grind instead of snap. That doesn't mean it's safe forever. Nothing is. It means the almost remains more likely than the after. And here's a quiet, slightly uncomfortable thought. Many Americans don't actually want resolution, not fully. Resolution requires agreement. Agreement requires concession, and concession feels like loss. Living in tension allows everyone to believe they're one election, one ruling, one movement away from finally being right. That belief is motivating, even comforting. So the system continues, powered by frustration, stabilized by disagreement. From the outside, this looks chaotic, dysfunctional, unsustainable. From the inside, it feels normal, annoying, familiar. That familiarity is what lets people sleep at night even while headlines scream. Which brings us back here, to this slow monologue, to this long look at a country that keeps almost falling apart and then doesn't. Not because it finds peace, but because it finds equilibrium. An uneasy one, a temporary one, but enough. As we ease toward the end of this long night, there's no revelation waiting, no moral to circle. Just the recognition that America's greatest crisis has never been a single event. It's endurance. Enduring disagreement, enduring disappointment,
enduring the discomfort of never being finished. That endurance has a cost, but so far it has also been the reason the lights stay on. Let that sit gently. No need to judge it tonight. History doesn't demand conclusions. It just records what keeps happening. And what keeps happening for now is this.
By now, you might start noticing a subtle, uncomfortable pattern in America's near-collapse moments. It's not about big, explosive catastrophes, not about single days where everything fails spectacularly. It's about people behaving in deeply human, sometimes frustrating ways, and systems responding imperfectly, but often just enough. Human nature is the constant here. And human nature is complicated. People panic, they misjudge risk, they overreact, they argue, they refuse compromise, they hold grudges for decades. They love their neighbors and simultaneously mistrust them. That contradiction has always been America's quiet undercurrent. Think about it. In the 1860s, families were divided by the Civil War, sometimes literally across dinner tables. People wrote letters hoping the other side would survive. Some fled, others fought. Loyalties were messy. Fear and hope danced together like uninvited guests at every dinner. In the 1930s, millions of Americans stared at shuttered banks, lost savings, and empty store shelves. Yet somehow they queued again the next day. They paid taxes, they delivered supplies, they continued living. Small acts, boring, necessary, almost invisible. In the 1960s and 70s, as protests erupted over civil rights and war, people on both sides of debates were convinced the nation could break apart over ideology. And yet, schools opened, work continued, legislatures passed slow, awkward compromises. Society didn't explode, it creaked, but it endured. In 2020, during a global pandemic, millions were quarantined, afraid, angry, politically divided. And yet, groceries were delivered, mail reached homes, hospitals functioned, and life continued in imperfect rhythms. The pattern is the same. Humans panic, humans resist, humans fail, but they also persist. And that persistence, small, ordinary, often unnoticed, is the glue that keeps a nation from fully collapsing. America almost falls apart not with heroics, not with perfectly executed plans, not with a last-minute savior event. It almost falls apart in increments. Mismanaged fear, eroded trust, unequal power, stubborn inaction, and disagreement left unresolved. And yet, each time, someone, somewhere, does the mundane thing. They show up, they write the check, they enforce a rule, they go to work, they vote, they teach, they farm, they heal. Those are the invisible acts of preservation. Here's the subtle irony. The closer to the edge, the more these small, boring acts matter. Even though panic dominates headlines, it's routine human commitment that prevents the collapse. History shows this again and again. The edge is not a moment, it's a condition, a constant negotiation between chaos and order, between fear and persistence, between despair and the quiet stubbornness of people who simply refuse to give up. And that's why, despite every near disaster, America persists. It's not indestructible, not moral, not heroic, just persistent. Persistence is boring, it's unglamorous, it doesn't trend, but it matters more than any single dramatic event. So, as we drift slowly through this narrative tonight, let yourself notice the nation has always survived, not because it is perfect, but because humans continue their imperfect routines. And in that quiet, mundane effort lies the real story of almost falling apart. America almost collapses, and then it doesn't, because people keep doing the small, ordinary, essential things that no history book glorifies. And that, somehow, has always been enough. By now, it's clear. America's near collapse isn't a single event. It's a recurring condition.
The edge is not a destination. It's more like a permanent address, a place the country keeps returning to again and again. And it's exhausting to watch, or to live through, or in our case, to narrate slowly so that you can almost drift off while thinking about it. History shows that the country almost falls apart in patterns: economic tension, political division, ideological extremism, civil unrest, and fear. Always fear. Fear is the most reliable ingredient in the recipe. And yet, the United States has repeatedly avoided total collapse because enough people keep showing up. Showing up is not heroic. It is not glamorous. It is routine. People vote. People pay taxes. People enforce laws. People educate children. People deliver goods. People debate, negotiate, complain. They persist in the mundane. And that persistence, over decades, becomes the quiet engine of survival. The irony is that the nation is strongest when it seems weakest, when headlines scream, when trust is low, when frustration peaks. That's when the boring human glue matters most. And the edge remains, always, waiting, whispering, this could be the one. Every generation believes the ground beneath them is shakier than before, and usually they're not entirely wrong. Farmers in the 1790s feared central authority. Citizens in the 1830s feared financial ruin. Americans in the 1930s feared unemployment and hunger. Soldiers in the 1860s feared civil war tearing the nation apart. Families in 2020 feared illness, political division, and societal collapse. Each moment felt like the end, and yet life continued. Routine persisted. People showed up. Institutions functioned, imperfectly, but functioned. History teaches a lesson here, subtle but important. Collapse requires agreement. Not everyone agreeing on the system's fragility. Not enough people showing up to maintain it. Indifference, not disagreement, is what truly topples nations. And America, frustratingly, stubbornly, continues to resist indifference. Even when part of the population believes the country has failed them, even when cynicism dominates headlines, even when optimism seems foolish, enough people care, enough to maintain the routines that matter. That's why, for now, the nation persists. It persists in a messy, imperfect, infuriatingly inconsistent way, but it persists. Which brings us to a subtle realization. The story of the day America almost fell apart doesn't end. It never ends. Because almost isn't a moment. Almost is a habit. Almost is the way America navigates its tensions. Almost is embedded in the national character. Almost is the rhythm of survival. So as we close this chapter, or drift into the next quiet night, there is nothing to resolve, nothing triumphant, nothing dramatically conclusive. Just the soft hum of a nation that has teetered, that has argued, that has feared, that has survived, that continues to show up. And somehow, improbably, still stands. The day America almost fell apart is still here, every day, in every decision, every argument, every small, quiet, essential act of routine. And it will be.
By this point, a strange thing happens in the story of America almost falling apart. Almost becomes ordinary. It's no longer an exception, no longer a headline that shocks the nation. It becomes the background noise, the subtle rhythm of everyday life. Economics wobble. Elections are contentious. Protests fill streets. Trust in institutions fluctuates. Fear simmers quietly in households.
And still, groceries arrive, schools open, courts issue rulings. The nation keeps moving. That's what makes the edge both terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because it's unpredictable. Comforting because it persists. People continue doing what must be done. Not perfectly, not heroically, just enough. History shows that ordinary persistence prevents extraordinary collapse. Think about it. During the Whiskey Rebellion, citizens protested violently, but enough people still paid taxes and followed laws, preventing a full breakdown. During the Panic of 1837, banks failed, markets crashed, and yet daily commerce continued. Households adjusted, and cities endured. During Watergate, trust in government plummeted, but the machinery of elections, Congress, and the judiciary carried the nation forward. During the COVID-19 pandemic, millions stayed home, millions kept working, millions cared for family and neighbors, holding society together in tiny, almost invisible ways. America almost falls apart, not in single cataclysmic moments, but in the slow accumulation of tension, distrust, inequality, anger, miscommunication. And it survives because humans keep performing the boring, necessary acts that allow society to function. Almost has become ordinary. And ordinary, when practiced consistently, is surprisingly resilient. The edge over time ceases to feel like an edge at all. It becomes the perpetual horizon, always near, always visible, always whispering uncertainty. And yet, people show up, people argue, people endure, people persist. That's the quiet, often overlooked miracle of history. Not heroism, not perfection, not triumph, just ordinary persistence under extraordinary stress. All right, let's settle in for the final stretch. Slow, quiet, unhurried. Let the story rest in your mind like a low hum. By now, it should be clear. America almost falling apart is not a singular day, not a dramatic climax, not a story with fireworks. It is a long, slow, recurring condition stitched into the rhythm of the nation. And here is the subtle truth. It persists because people persist. Ordinary, imperfect, slightly frustrating humans continue to show up. They continue to care just enough. They perform daily acts that might seem invisible, mundane, even dull. But together, those acts prevent collapse. The almost in American history is not heroic. It is procedural. It is routine. It is endurance practiced quietly, habitually, over decades, over centuries. Farmers plant crops, citizens vote, teachers teach, judges rule, neighbors help neighbors, and the nation moves forward, imperfectly, slowly, uncertainly. There is no grand resolution, no final reconciliation. The tension, the edge, the near failures, they will return. History is full of them, and they always will. But there is a kind of calm in this understanding. Not optimism, not triumph, just awareness. Recognition of a pattern that has held again and again. Almost collapse, quietly prevented by ordinary persistence. America continues to show up, to argue, to endure, to adjust, to manage the cracks in its foundation. Not perfectly, not morally, not decisively, but persistently. And somehow, improbably, against the odds, it survives. So as you let your mind drift now, remember, the day America almost fell apart is not behind us. It is not ahead. It is everywhere. It is the quiet tension that hums through every election, every court case, every disagreement, every routine act that keeps a nation functioning. And tonight, in this long pause, in the dim light of reflection, that tension does not have to be frightening. It can be comforting, because it is also the reason the lights stay on. The edge is always there. The almost is always near. And yet, here we are, still arguing, still breathing, still persisting. That is the story. Not a climax, not a finale, just persistence. Continuous, imperfect, human persistence. The country will face new challenges tomorrow. It always does. But for tonight, it has survived. And so can we. Dim the lights a little more. Let the hum settle. The day America almost fell apart was never a single day. It is every day. And somehow, it continues. Sleep now. History will keep humming.